and we're starting this morning with this session, which is going to be introduced by John Rees. John is an author, an activist. He's an officer of the Stop the War Coalition and a founding member of Counterfire. He's written many books, including in rapid succession, Marxism and the English Revolution, a theoretical book here, and very recently, The Fiery Spirits, Popular Protest, Parliament and the English Revolution, which is a kind of follows on from an earlier volume, The Leveller Revolution. Both of them are absolutely brilliant reads and are on sale here today, and you can even ask John to sign them at the end of the session. So John's going to be speaking about a particular aspect of the research for the book. He's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to open up for questions and comments and further discussion. So over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Kate. The first thing to say is about the significance of the English Revolution as a whole. It's the first of the modern revolutions, the first of the revolutionary series, if you like, or sequence that runs through the American Revolution of 1776, the French Revolution of 1789. In other words, a sequence of revolutions that really gave birth to the modern world. And the English Revolution is a truly remarkable event because in 1649, after a decade of revolution and civil war, the English people did something absolutely unprecedented. They put their king on public trial for treason against the people. They found him guilty, and he was executed, beheaded, on a platform erected in Whitehall, outside the banqueting house, exactly where the banqueting house still stands in Whitehall. And that was a moment which was utterly transformatory because nobody had ever done this before. Of course, monarchs had died at the hands of their rivals, been killed by members of their family, lost their lives on the battlefield. But they had never, in the whole history of the related term to king, of Shah, or Caesar, or Tsar, in the entire history of those terms, no monarch had ever been put on public trial for treason against the people. In fact, the very thought was impossible. Subjects could be treasonous against the monarch, but the monarch couldn't conceivably be treasonous towards the people. It was a world, in the phrase of the people of the time, a world turned upside down. And what I want to do today is to examine one moment in the path towards the execution of Charles I and the establishment of one of the first modern republics in the world, in this country. So we're going to be talking not about 1649 primarily, but about the middle of the First Civil War, 1643. So the second year of the Civil War in England, the fourth year since the opening of the Long Parliament. Charles I forced, after 11 years of personal rule, where he'd ruled without a parliament, forced for financial reasons, because the war with the Scottish, the attempt to impose the English prayer book in Scotland had resulted in two so-called bishops' wars, which Charles I had lost and needed to call a parliament in order to find the money for an army. So 4 years since the opening of the Long Parliament, England at war for 2 years. And this is the story of one attempt by the Royalists to overthrow parliamentary rule in London. It's a plot conceived in Oxford, which was the king's capital. He'd been driven out of London, primarily by mobilisations of the London crowd. In early 1642, he'd set up his new capital in Oxford, and it was a plot conceived in Oxford to overthrow the rule of Parliament in in London. And we're going to be looking at it in a particular way, because the story of this plot, its discovery, was told to Londoners, actually to people at large, but mostly to Londoners at the time, in many pamphlets and news stories, but in particular by this broadsheet. There's the title: "The Malignant's Treacherous and Bloody Plot Against Parliament and the City of London, which was by God's providence happily prevented in May 31, 1643. Now, this document, you can see it if you're lucky enough to get into the British Library. It's in the archives in the British Library. It's part of the Thomason Tracts. The Thomason Tracts are 20,000 Civil War pamphlets, broadsheets, single-sheet publications collected by the bookseller George Thomason. It's one of the single biggest archives that historians of the English Revolution can look to. And you can see Thomason's handwriting there on the bottom of the broadsheet telling us when he acquired it. He acquired it in London on August the 18th, 1643. So all those people who've ever been accused of hoarding books and been told of the necessity of getting rid of them, just stick to it, because historians for centuries afterwards will be grateful to you, perhaps. So this was printed by John Hancock Sr. At his print shop in Pope's Head Alley. Pope's Head Alley is just down by the Bank of England. It's still there, a narrow alleyway running between Cornhill and Lombard Street. We're fortunate in one sense that the entire street geography of the City of London is still pretty much as it was in 1640. Although all the buildings were burnt down by the Great Fire in 1666, we owe it to the avarice of insurance companies that the street plan is still just as it was, because Christopher Wren, of course, was employed to rebuild St. Paul's after the Great Fire, wanted to rebuild the City of London on a grid system. But the insurance companies stepped in and said, no, you can't do that, because we won't be able to calculate the losses if you start mucking about with the street pattern. And so Wren's attempt to rebuild the City of London as a grid was abandoned in favour of the insurance company's ability to calculate claims on the losses. And to that intervention, we owe the fact that the street pattern is pretty much as it was in the 1640s. So you can still wander through Pope's Head Alley, where John Hancock's printing operation was. Now, Hancock was quite a radical printer, a parliamentarian printer. He worked with some of the Levellers, indeed printed some of John Lilburn's pamphlet, worked with the Leveller printer Thomas Paine in producing what were essentially illegal pamphlets. But this isn't an illegal pamphlet. This is an officially sanctioned parliamentary account of the plot against them and its discovery. And we're going to follow that plot as Londoners themselves would have followed it, reading what is, you have to say, an early attempt at a graphic novel. So the plot was named after this man, Edmund Waller. Edmund Waller was the son of a wealthy Buckinghamshire landowner. He was one of the youngest members of Parliament when he entered it in 1624. His relatives, although he was an arch Royalist, his relatives, William Waller was a parliamentarian general, and Hardress Waller also fought for Parliament. Both of them also MPs in the long Parliament. Waller was an ardent Royalist. He was with the king in Oxford, but the king directed him to go back to Parliament, and Lord Clarendon, at the time the Earl of Hyde, Charles I's senior political advisor, said that Edmund Waller was the boldest spirit in defence of royalism in the House of Commons. After the Restoration, the Earl of Rochester described Waller's poetry in this way. He said, "He best can turn in force and soften things, to praise great conquerors and to flatter kings." So, and Rochester was no saint himself. So we have here a picture of somebody utterly devoted to the king's cause. One of his primary opponents, and one of the fiery spirits, after which the book is named, the fiery spirits was a term used by contemporaries for the radicals, the Republicans, ultimately the regicides, in the regicides being the people who signed the King's death warrant in 1649 in the House of Parliament. This is Henry Martyn, the leader of what John Aubrey, the diarist of the time, called Henry Martyn's gang, or the violent or fiery spirits. He was MP for Berkshire. He was, as Aubrey described him, as different from a Puritan as light is from dark. He was able to turn the House with a single speech. He was also one of the wittiest people in a House of Commons, which then as now wasn't really noted for the humour of its MPs. There's a famous anecdote that Martyn was catnapping on the benches of the House of Commons, and one of his political opponents got up and moved a motion that the nodders should be put out. In other words, that the MPs who were falling asleep should be kicked out of the Commons. But Martyn wasn't quite as asleep as he looked, and he leapt to his feet and moved an amendment which said that the noddies, the bores that put them to sleep, should be kicked out of the House of Commons. And he was one of the targets of the Waller plot. If the Waller plot had been successful, Martyn would have been jailed and probably executed. So let's talk a little bit about the plot. Hatched in Oxford, as I said, the King's commission to raise forces against the Parliament was sent to London. It was carried to London by Lady Albany, Catherine Howard. She took it from London. She got a parliamentary pass on the grounds that she was conducting family business in London. She brought the King's commission to London, hidden, depending on which account you favour, either stuffed in her bodice or stuck inside her hair, on the grounds that parliamentarian soldiers probably wouldn't give her a body search. She was quite correct in that. She got through, brought the commission to London. Waller was the centrepiece of the plot in London. Nathaniel Tompkins, who was a clerk to the Queen, had previously been an MP. Clerk to the Queen, Henrietta Maria, was one of the conspirators. Richard Challoner, a wealthy merchant, was another of the conspirators. This frame shows Lady Albany addressing, you can see in her hands, the King's commission with the seal dangling from the bottom of it. It's probably unlikely that the conspirators ever met all together like this. They had a cell structure where the cells were no bigger than 3 people in order to protect themselves. So she probably didn't address them all quite as collectively as this. This is Catherine Howard, painted by Anthony Van Dyck, probably at the time of her marriage to Lord George Stuart. Stuart was killed, probably about 1638. Stuart was killed on the first battlefield of the Civil War in Edge Hill, and Lady D'Aubigny became a favourite of the court, an intimate of Archbishop Laud, who was Charles I's clerical enforcer, a favourite at court, and she spied both in the Waller plot and subsequently was extensively employed as a spy, as a royalist spy. The plan in the plot was that the King's troops under Prince Rupert would rally outside the city walls. It was rumoured that there were already 1,000 rogues from Oxford. Later accounts said 3,000, ready and willing to rise within the City of London on the command of this committee of conspirators who had received the King's instructions to do so. They were instructed to seize the Tower of London. The Tower of London is an absolutely key institution in 17th century London. London is still, at this point, a walled city, and the Tower of London anchors the eastern end of the wall, which then runs right the way round the top of Farringdon and Moorfields and down to the bottom of Fleet Street, just beyond St Paul's. So the Tower is a key fortification. It's also the home of the Mint. It's also the depository for huge amounts of merchant wealth, and it's a continual flashpoint throughout the English Revolution. There have already been attempts by the King before he was driven from London to seize the Tower. This has been defeated by a parliamentary mobilisation. Part of the conspiracy in the Waller plot is to seize the Tower of London. London isn't only defended by the Tower, not primarily defended by the Tower. In the months before the Waller plot in May 1643, for 6 or 9 months beforehand, the whole London population has been mobilised to create 11 miles of what were called the lines of communication, of trenches, forts, outworks, which stretch right the way around London, then along the South Bank, protecting Southwark, and coming back to London Bridge, which is the only bridge over the Thames at this time. And these were built by a huge organised effort of Londoners in their craft guilds, going out day after day to entrench London. This is the picture here is of Mount Mill, which was in Shoreditch. It was the biggest of the forts, the first of the forts to be constructed. And I'll see if I can just find you the description. There was a guy called William Lithgow who was a Scots visitor to London at this time, and he walked the whole of the lines of communication, and he's left us this absolutely brilliant description of how the forts looked at this time and how they were built. So this is William Lithgow describing how Londoners built the lines of communication. He says, "The daily musters and shows of all sorts of Londoners here were wondrous commendable in marching to the fields and outworks, as merchants, silkmen, macers, shopkeepers, and so on, with great alacrity, carrying on their shoulders iron mattocks and wooden shovels, with roaring drums, flying colours, and girded with swords, most companies also being interlarded with ladies, women, and girls, 2 and 2, carrying baskets for the advance of the labour." So for months, Londoners have been constructing this, and of course the Royalist plot involved a scheme to seize hold of this. It's hard to imagine something which would have been more enraging for parliamentarian Londoners than to see the Royalists seize what had been an enormous collective work of defence. They would have also tried to seize the Guildhall, which was at this time, exactly where it is now in the City of London, but was also a magazine. They wanted to seize the house of Alderman Folk from the City of London, who also had a magazine at his house. So that you could see the business here, trying to seize the Tower, the magazines, the outworks of London, trying to get hold of, take over, control the military strong points of the city, and to arrest the City Militia Committee. Now, the City Militia Committee is an absolutely key institution in the Civil War. The political construction, if you like, of the parliamentarian side at this time is that the Long Parliament is directing the war effort. But it has no executive. So, the executive in the 17th century was the king and the court. So there was no cabinet. There were no government institutions. It lacked the ability to enact any decision that it took. So what Parliament does in the course of the Civil War is begin to massively expand the committee system. There's a committee for public safety is established, a militia committee, a finance committee, and these have their counterparts in the City of London, where the merchant wealth is mobilised for the defence of Parliament. The City Militia Committee is packed with radicals, is packed with allies of the fiery spirits. The liaison between the City Militia Committee and the Militia Committee in Parliament is conducted by Henry Martin and his allies, and the attempt in the Waller plot, the Royalist attempt, is to arrest the entire Militia Committee, to behead the organisational structure which is conducting the parliamentarian war effort. The two Houses of Parliament, obviously the Lords and the Commons, all the parliamentarian supporters are being targeted by this plot. Lord Say and Seeley, so-called Old Subtlety, a long-standing, relatively moderate, but a long-standing supporter of Parliament, would have been arrested. John Pym, so-called King Pym, the leader of the parliamentarian side in the Commons, would be arrested. William Strode, who is the MP for Bir Alston in Plympton in Devon, he's one of the key fiery spirits. He would have been arrested. He'd been targeted by Charles I as one of the 5 members that Charles I tried to arrest before the crowds threw him out of London. John Hampden, one of the most influential of the parliamentarian figures. You can, as you walk into the Commons down the long corridor today, there's still Hampden's statue is there on one side. He's weeks away from losing his life at the Battle of Chargrove Field, and Philip Stapleton. All these leading parliamentarians being targeted for arrest in this plot. The King's children, who are at St James's, they would have been taken into custody, and in mid-May, the signal that this plot is going to be enacted was that a message would be sent from London to Oxford that the great ship has come into the Downs. And that message was sent to Oxford, received by Lucius Carey, Lord Falkland, and so that was the signal that the troops outside the city gates should be mobilised and ready to invade the city. So an extensive plot aimed at the entire overthrow of parliamentarian rule, the arrest of the leading parliamentarian figures. But it all goes hideously wrong. Well, hideously wrong for the Royalists, that is. Some of the people indeed Alexander Hampden, relative of John Hampden, one of the messengers that comes from Oxford to London, is overheard talking about the plot, and this gets as far as the parliamentarian leaders, so they begin to sense that something's afoot. Another of the messengers from Oxford warns the Earl of Bath to get his family out of London because something serious is about to happen, and this rumour too makes its way back to the parliamentarian leaders. In the end, one of the servants of Nathaniel Tompkins, who we met earlier, one of the key plotters, comes to John Pym and says that he's heard his master talking about this plot. So Pym turns the servant, tells him to go back to Tompkins' house, and he hides behind a hanging tapestry in Nathaniel Tompkins' house, and here's Nathaniel Tompkins and Edmund Waller discussing the plot and saying, if we succeed in this, we will have everything. And this gets reported back to John Pym, and the plotters are then arrested. Soldiers are sent to their houses, they're seized, Waller is arrested, Tompkins is arrested, Richard Challoner is arrested, their houses are searched, the King's Commission is found buried in the cellar of Challoner's merchant house in the city of London. And what's as important as the fact that the parliamentarians have discovered this is the huge political capital which they then make out of it. So Pym recalls Parliament. It's a fast day, so everybody is fasting at church and whatnot. Recalls Parliament. Messengers are sent out. The MP and moderate MP, Sir Simon Dews, is at the church in Covent Garden. Soldiers arrive at the gates, call the MPs out, tell them to get back down to the House of Commons. Londoners are in the streets thinking that there's going to be an attack. Soldiers are deployed, called out, and there's then a huge sort of reveal in the House of Commons by Pym and Strode and Martin about the nature of the plot, and then using the political dynamic that they've gathered from uncovering the plot, things that the radicals have been trying to pass for ages just start going through the Commons very, very quickly. So there's a huge propaganda operation, of which this broadsheet that we're looking at is one aspect. And the plot, it's ordered that accounts of the plot will be read out in every pulpit, in every church in the city on Sunday. The printing presses are rolling out not just this broadsheet, but many other accounts of the plot, official and unofficial, as well. And the Parliament, William Strode and others, Martin and others, have been talking about the issuing of a vow and covenant of loyalty to the Parliament for ages. Haven't been able to get it through Parliament. In the wake of the Waller plot, it goes through in a single day. A day of Thanksgiving is announced, and you can see in this frame both the covenant. This guy on this side is talking about the covenant, and there you can see the Thanksgiving from a pulpit in the city. So a huge political victory for the parliamentarian side and for the radicals on the parliamentarian side because of the discovery and the revelation of the Waller plot. Not such good news for the plotters. By and large, punishment follows the social gradient. Lady Daubonnet is locked up for a while, but is then released. The leading aristocratic figures like the Earl of Northumberland and the Earl of Conway are pretty quickly released, although William Strode is campaigning for them to be locked up, and indeed for the House of Lords to be abolished if they aren't locked up. But the less exalted conspirators here, Nathaniel Tompkins and Richard Challoner, are hung outside their own houses in the city. Tompkins in Fetter Lane, just by Fleet Street, Challoner by Cornhill, just down by the Bank of England. Waller escapes because he is allowed to plead to the House of Commons. He's allowed to go into exile. Some accounts say that he used his enormous wealth to bribe the entire House of Commons. I don't know exactly how many people were bribed, but he was certainly lavish in his generosity to his fellow MPs when they let him off. So that's just one episode, right in the middle of the Civil War. But what I think it does is it illuminates a number of things. It illuminates the relationship between popular mobilization, popular print, and the ideological and political battles that were taking place. It shows the political dynamic by which radicals were able to advance their cause by seizing on a political moment, discomforting not just the Royalists who'd been discovered, but the moderate parliamentarians who'd been conducting a peace treaty all this time in Oxford, wanted to come to an accommodation with the king, but the exposure of the Royalist plot shows that the king, and this was a repeated experience both before and after this, the king cannot be trusted, and therefore the stance of the radicals that the war has to be fought through to the end, that the king has to be dealt with decisively, that the monarchy can't simply be restored on better terms. That argument begins to gain ground. Now, as I say, this is just one episode in that longer story, and that story is repeated a whole number of times before we get to 1649 and the execution of the king. But it shows, I think, the political dynamic between royalism, popular mobilisation, and the division between radicals and moderates within the parliamentary camp.